Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. We're really glad that you've joined us for this discussion today. As Sheila mentioned, I'm a lead economist at the World Bank working on issues of urban poverty, service delivery, climate change, among other things. Today I'm going to present some work that's been carried out over the past 18 months. This is a study that the World Bank has done on the issues of climate change disaster risk in the urban poor. The presentation will cover four key issues. The first is the background and approach of the study and how we looked at it. Secondly is to give it some context, looking at the vulnerability of cities, what makes them vulnerable. Thirdly, the vulnerability of the urban poor. And then fourthly, hopefully we'll switch to a more upbeat topic looking at how cities actually can build resilience for the urban poor. As some background, the Mayor's Task Force was launched in December 2009 at the Mayor's Summit in Copenhagen during COP15. This was launched by the President of the World Bank. With 3 or 4 key objectives. The first really was to better understand the links between these 3 issues, climate change, disaster risk, and the urban poor. Secondly, to identify good practices for building resilience and what cities can do. And thirdly, to propose policy and investment programs that could be scaled up, especially looking at financing opportunities. The key task force members comprise the mayors of Dar es Salaam, Jakarta, Mexico City, and Sao Paulo. They were present at the meeting in December 2009 and showed strong commitment to be on the task force and address these issues, and have stayed with it throughout the process and have been very, very important partners in carrying this work forward. In terms of the approach, again, I mentioned we have done a global study. This was led by the World Bank, and it brought together global experiences in so many different fields, and I think it really provides a wealth of information. The final report is just about to be launched, but some of the background pieces are available, and the website will be at the end as an attachment. We also carried out city-level case studies within the 4 cities, and those were done in partnership with the country teams, the city level teams, and the World Bank. And in those we used a framework called an urban risk assessment to look at institutional, socioeconomic, and hazard impact. We compiled a lot of existing information. There wasn't a lot of new data collection. But even just bringing some of this information together was carried out for the first time in all 4 cities. There was also some field work which did some institutional mapping and interviews with low-income households in poor neighborhoods. So again, to give some context, why are cities vulnerable? Well, we know that urbanization is really defining this century. We've got something like 70 million people that move to cities every year in the developing world. This is putting enormous pressure on city governments to provide urban infrastructure, services, and safe land where people can live. Cities typically are quite vulnerable to the impacts of natural hazards and climate change, largely because they're often located in coastal areas, along rivers, often in seismic zones and cyclone-prone areas. And this is linked to some historic reasons about access to transport and ports and things. But nonetheless, they are in hazardous zones. We know that some 2/3 of urban settlements with less than 5 million people are in low elevation coastal zones, which puts them at high risk. And the change in climate is resulting in more extreme weather events, which is leading to flooding and coastal storms, sea level rise, and higher temperatures for the populations. And we're already seeing some of these effects. For many cities, the more extreme weather means increases in heavy rains, possibly droughts and heat waves. Other aspects with regard to the context of vulnerable cities is related to the impacts. And the first area really where there are 3 key areas where the impacts are substantial. The first is on the built environment, and there we're seeing stress on building foundations, roads, water, sewage, and drainage systems. Secondly is the stress on the natural environment, and that is resulting in the salinization of water sources, the depletion of groundwater, and altered ecosystems. And thirdly is the impact on people, on residents in cities. We've seen changing disease vectors, which increases illnesses, disruption in basic services. In extreme events, there are food shortages and shortages of other supplies, and for many, loss of housing, communities, and jobs that we've seen in many natural hazards in the last few years. The impacts of disasters really are more devastating in cities because of the high concentration of economic assets and people. It's just a higher concentration of these things in urban areas, so the impacts generally are greater. There have been several attempts to try to rank exposure in cities, to look at which cities are the most vulnerable, and looking at either economic value of assets or looking at human risk, several different dimensions. I won't go through them. One could criticize each of the methods that are used, but something that is common across all of them is that they are all showing an increase in risk for cities. Switching now to the vulnerability of the urban poor, really through the analysis in this study we were able to document some of the challenges that the urban poor are facing, and they truly are on the front line. They are the ones that are most affected. It tends to be by the low intensity, high frequency events. So it's not the major earthquakes, which are of course devastating when they happen, but it's the day-to-day flooding from heavy rains and lack of drainage and heat waves that are affecting the urban poor the most. Part of the reason that they are so vulnerable is that they live really on the most undesirable lands. They're living in squatter settlements and in slums, which are on steep hillsides or floodplains or coastal areas. This is mainly because these are the areas where nobody else chooses to live who can afford to live somewhere else, and so they're at very high risk. Also, the quality of housing tends to be quite low. A second major challenge is that the basic services are really limited. Poor drainage and poor solid waste collection and water and sanitation can take a simple heavy rain and turn it into a flood. It can, again, cause problems of water scarcity and contamination. The lack of solid waste disposal can block drainage channels. Poor roads mean that emergency service vehicles can't get in or out if they need to. So these all put vulnerability onto the urban poor. Just to give you a couple of photos, this is a fairly typical slum settlement. I believe this one's from Jakarta, but not unusual for other parts of the world as well. Here's a couple more. Here on the right, you see the steep hillside in the favelas in Brazil. Again, you can imagine during a heavy rain, if there's a landslide, what happens to the people living in these houses. Other issues that make the poor vulnerable are linked to the density where they live. Again, slum settlements tend to be highly dense, and it means that disease can spread very rapidly through the slums. The layout and site conditions of slums can also affect risk. In the report, we go through the various layouts that slum settlements tend to be set up as, and the different impacts that they can have. Also, the urban poor tend to have less information and fewer safety nets than the non-poor because they tend to work in the informal sector. They don't have access to social programs. In terms of coping mechanisms, the urban poor often rely on the social networks in their neighborhoods and communities and ad hoc adaptation methods. And there are a lot of interesting things that we can talk about towards the end that the urban poor are doing to adapt. But sometimes these are not actually appropriate solutions, and what might be a temporary fix turns into a longer term problem or something that we call maladaptation. So now I'm going to switch a little bit to what we've come out with as some strategies that cities can attempt in trying to build resilience for the urban poor. And I should mention that these draw very much on some of the good practices that we found from the case studies and from global experiences around the world. And there are a lot of exciting things happening, and I think a lot of opportunity. The first really key message that I want to make here on this is that cities are the drivers for addressing urban risk. It's not national governments or communities, but it's actually cities that city governments, local governments that need to take a leadership role in addressing the risk in their own cities. But this relies very much on good institutions that can design and implement policies. There are 5 key areas that I will discuss, and I'll start with the first, which is understanding risk at the city and community level. Now, obviously, this is an important starting point. Without understanding the risk in any given city, it's very, very difficult to address the challenges and come up with strategies on how to deal with it. There's a framework that we have developed here at the World Bank in partnership with UN Habitat, UNEP, a number of other donors, the GFDRR, other stakeholders, which really takes a 3-dimensional look at problems of risk. We have, you can see from the diagram, we have an institutional assessment, a hazard assessment, and a socioeconomic assessment. And some risk assessments do one or the other, but I believe that this multi-sectoral approach is very, very useful for trying to understand problems in any given city. Also, it's worth mentioning that the approach was designed as something of a pyramid. If you start at the very bottom of the pyramid, for say a given city, maybe a small town in Africa that doesn't have a lot of capacity or resources and wants to just get a handle on the nature of the problem and do some geospatial identification of where the risks are, where the vulnerable groups are, they can use things like Google Maps and very, very simple technologies. And then as you go up the pyramid, you go up in levels of sophistication, and you end up with some cities like Bogota, Colombia has done, a risk assessment maybe costing $1 million. Not all cities can do that, and that's what's, I think, nice about the framework. Just to give you a visual image of some of the work that was done in the case studies, this is an overlaid map of the you can't see it very well, but the high-risk areas of flooding and the urban poor, just to give you a sense of how we can identify hotspots using the risk assessment. There were some lessons that came out. We did it in the 4 case study cities. There were some important lessons which I think are worth highlighting. The first is the importance of data. I can't stress it enough. Having good data is critical for decision making, and it was critical for trying to do the risk assessments. It didn't always go as smoothly as we liked. Data was all over the place in different ministries and people's hard drives. But setting up a framework for collecting and monitoring data on hazard, institutional, and socioeconomic risk is really essential. Secondly, an innovation that we did we drew upon really is mapping of informal settlements. There's a lot of work that's happening now that you've probably heard of, initiatives like OpenStreetMap, Map Kibera. Slum Dwellers International is doing a lot of mapping of informal settlements. And in many cases, this is the first time that it's happening in cities. It's using new technologies. It's very, very important tool to understanding risks. Other key lessons from the city cases, one was that this framework, the multidimensional approach, was quite useful. High-level support in carrying this out from the level of the mayor's office was essential. It meant that agencies came to the table, they opened up their databases and their information sources and made it available because of this high-level support. Probably the most important piece of this was the coordination across agencies. In many cases, it was the first time that agencies sat down together in Mexico City. There were 42 agencies that gathered together around doing the risk assessment. But it wasn't just ending there. This has opened a a dialogue. An interagency committee has been set up. It's opened up a dialogue across agencies. Those are agencies that work on climate change, on disaster risk, on urban planning and management, on urban poverty reduction, and in basic services. So you can imagine how important that could be. The other area was that access to information. The other challenge was really difficult, and I think I mentioned that. Finally, on doing a risk assessment, of course the next step would be an action plan. And it would involve the same agencies, and it follows out naturally from doing the risk assessment. And that's the process that's happening now in the cities where we were working. Switching now to the second area where I think cities can do a lot, and that's a very, very important aspect of really integrating urban risk reduction into urban planning and management. This doesn't always happen historically. Urban planners haven't historically been working on all the challenges of risk, and especially with regard to climate change. And we have a lot of good cases where that's happening. Again, these are documented in the study. Some in developing countries include Cape Town, Ho Chi Minh City, Quito, Jakarta, where they took some of the new challenges coming from climate change adaptation and integrated them into regular, traditional urban plans. Now, when doing this, unfortunately, they're like everything related to policy and economic and social development. There are a number of trade-offs that come between risk reduction, urban development, and poverty reduction, and it makes it actually very, very difficult and challenging. Probably the policy that can have the biggest impact is on land use policies, and that some of those interventions involve preventing building and settlements in high-risk areas, proactive sites and services projects for slum upgrading and for low-income housing, which was very popular in the 80s, but has sort of fallen off, mostly because of land constraints. But the trade-off there comes with people want to live in the center of towns and be close to services and jobs, but oftentimes the safe lands is not available. So it requires people to live in the periphery. To do that, of course, then one needs to think about efficient transport systems. This can be an important instrument for increasing land supply with access and mobility. But on the downside, it can result in urban sprawl and create other kinds of problems related to greenhouse gas emissions and things. Another area, of course, is investing in slum upgrading and basic service provision. So this is something that, here at the World Bank we've been doing for 30 years. There are a lot of successful examples of how we can do this. And it's not a new solution, it's an old solution. In doing that, sometimes resettlement will be necessary, which is not always desirable. But there are some cases where lands are just too precarious and people shouldn't be living on them. It's better to use that land for something else to reduce the risk of vulnerable populations. Finally, it's important to mention there's a lot of uncertainty in all of this. We don't know what's going to happen. Some of the scenarios for climate change are very diverse. We really don't know necessarily what the impacts are going to be. We can look at historical data, we can infer, we can do climate models, but there is a lot of uncertainty. So we've looked at some of the tools that are out there for addressing that uncertainty. One is robust decision making, and with that it's sort of choosing the approach that really minimizes the negative consequences for stakeholders. To do that, obviously, you need to involve broad numbers of stakeholders in the discussions. That's communities, government agencies, researchers, and others in working through some of the negative outcomes and what is acceptable to populations. The third area is around strengthening institutional capacity to deliver results. So again, we know, made the point very clearly that cities really have to take a driving role in this. But local governments don't always have time or capacity, maybe expertise in this area. There are so many agencies that are involved. It's those that provide basic services. It's agencies working on climate change, institutions doing disaster risk management or disaster risk reduction. It's urban planners and managers and those working on poverty reduction programs. So you see that there's a lot of areas where capacity needs to be strengthened. The institutional arrangements in cities are also really complex when you look at some of the municipal and administrative boundaries. An example, in Mexico City, there are 50 geopolitical administrative units. Sao Paulo has 96 districts, and every single city that I've talked to in this context has a similar problem. The administrative boundaries is not where these natural hazards stop. So it's very, very important to get a lot of different agencies around the table, which makes it complex and challenging. There are, I just again want to highlight, one of the approaches that we did in the Mayor's Task Force was getting different agencies to work together and setting up intra-agency working groups. And those can start as an informal or a formal process and evolve over time. But I think the important thing is to start by getting people around the table to discuss the challenges and start working towards solutions. There are so many good practices out there looking at service delivery, slum upgrading, early warning systems, safety nets for the urban poor. Some of the lessons of what worked in those are that there was strong political commitment and leadership. There was good governance, good management, and the coordination issue that I talked about. Some of them might require new incentives, maybe a new structured reward system or open governance to get people to start working together and addressing some of the issues. I also want to take the opportunity to mention a number of capacity building programs that are out there. We have here through the World Bank E-Institute, there are several courses looking at sustainable land use management, cities and climate change, safe and resilient cities, disaster risk management, and these are open to participants all over the world. There are knowledge exchange activities, peer learning, other institutions such as the C40, ICLEI, Rockefeller, others have training opportunities and capacity building programs. So for anybody who might be out there thinking that they want to learn more, there are lots of opportunities, and I think those are only on the rise. The fourth area really about thinking about solutions is the importance of bridging communities and local governments to work together. There's so much happening at the community level, but at the same time, there's a big gap between local governments and the urban poor, and it's often around the issues of informality. Governments don't necessarily want to recognize informal settlements, or by law they may not be allowed to work in informal settlements. On the other hand, urban poor don't always understand the challenges and resource constraints that governments are under, and so there is often an antagonistic relationship. And there's a lot of scope, I think, for getting cities to work together more. I mentioned that there are some really good examples out there, and some of the lessons around those were, first of all, they worked because there was a mutual understanding and a recognition of roles and constraints that each side had. There was also an important understanding by city officials of what was happening at this local level, and likewise, local communities understanding the city's constraints. A key element in all of this was the importance of strong leaders and local organizations to facilitate any interactions across groups. Finally, this is the area where I have to say the cities really expressed the strongest interest to understand more, and it's probably the most challenging, and that's on financing. So, throughout the study, and even in my short presentation here, you probably heard mention of a lot of things which cost a lot of money. Investments are needed for physical infrastructure and basic services in slums, for information systems, tools for mainstreaming risk reduction policies into urban planning and management, capacity building, safety nets, and the list goes on. Not all of these are expensive. There are some small investments that can go a long way. To estimate the costs of adaptation, it's very challenging, and I have to say I don't think there's a consensus in the literature yet on what approach is the best. Cost-benefit analysis has been used. There's a case that we've elaborated that is from Casablanca. In that demonstration, it showed that really the most cost-effective approach was early warning systems, and I've seen that in several cities. It's a relatively low cost but extremely important tool for identifying risks and letting residents know to reduce their own risk to natural hazards. There's a little bit more experience with costing out slum improvements, which again are an important piece of adaptation. And I think, again, this is an area where the literature needs to go a little bit deeper, but I think there are a lot of opportunities. Some of the existing resources that are out there rely on national and local revenues, the private sector. There are models of PPPs, that's public-private partnerships for investing in infrastructure to reduce risk. There are a number of loans and grants through the development banks. But most of these programs are actually aimed at national governments, not specifically at cities. In the report, we've actually called for a program for cities and we're working on the details of that, where cities would need to do some basic analysis and some benchmarking following very common metrics and tools, and then commit to monitoring these over time. And with that, then they would be able to enter into this program for financing through one window, simplifying the maze of many, many programs that are out there.